There are moments in life that people never forget. Not because they were exciting, not because they were dangerous, but because they made absolutely no sense. Moments where something happens that simply should not be possible. Encounters that leave people questioning everything they thought they understood about reality. The people you're about to hear from aren't storytellers. Most of them didn't even want to talk about what happened to them. Because when you experience something like this, the first thing you do is try to convince yourself it didn't really happen. Tonight, we're going to hear 3 true horror encounters. 3 stories from ordinary people who found themselves face to face with something they still can't explain. The first story takes place nearly 25 years ago in Kolkata, India, at a crematorium where families come to say their final goodbyes, a place where death is expected. Almost 25 years ago, a man sat quietly near the edge of the Keoratola crematorium in Kolkata. For many people, the idea of spending time in a place like that would feel deeply unsettling. Crematoriums are places most people only visit during moments of grief. Places associated with loss, mourning, and final goodbyes. But for some locals who lived nearby, the Keoratola crematorium was simply part of the environment. It had been there for generations. During the day, the grounds were constantly active. Families arrived with the bodies of loved ones. Priests performed the long rituals. Workers carried bundles of wood and prepared the cremation platforms. Smoke rose slowly into the sky as flames consumed the funeral pyres. But after sunset, the entire atmosphere changed. The crowds disappeared into the night. The voices slowly faded away, and what remained was an eerie stillness that hung over the grounds. The only sounds were the quiet crackle of burning wood and the occasional distant movement of workers finishing their duties. That night, the man had come there simply to sit alone. He had been under a lot of stress lately and needed a place where he could think. Strangely, the crematorium provided exactly that. It was quiet, still, isolated from the noise of the city. He sat on a low concrete wall near one of the older cremation areas and pulled a cigarette from a small pack in his pocket. Back then, smoking in places like that wasn't unusual. Many people who waited for funeral ceremonies passed the time with cigarettes. The man lit his cigarette and slowly exhaled a cloud of smoke into the humid night air. The scent of ash and burnt wood already filled the atmosphere. The orange glow from distant cremation fires flickered against the darkness. For a few minutes, everything was quiet. Too quiet. He watched the dim shapes of workers moving slowly in the distance, tending to the final fires of the night. Most of the activity had already ended. Only a few pyres were still burning. He took another drag from his cigarette. That's when he heard footsteps, slow, measured, coming from somewhere behind him. At first, he assumed it was one of the workers. People still moved around the grounds occasionally at night, but something about the footsteps felt strange. They weren't hurried, they weren't purposeful. They sounded heavy, almost as if someone were walking with great effort. The man turned his head. A figure was approaching him through the dim yellow glow of a nearby lamp. As the figure got closer, he could see it was a man. He looked ordinary, middle-aged, maybe around 45. He wore a pale button-down shirt and dark trousers. Nothing about him stood out, but there was something about his expression that felt unusual. His face looked exhausted, not just tired, but drained, as if he had been through something physically and emotionally overwhelming. The man stopped a few feet away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the stranger looked directly at him and asked in a calm voice, "Do you have a light?" The man nodded automatically. "Yeah, sure," he replied. He reached into his pocket to grab the small box of matches he kept there. It took him maybe 2 seconds to find it. But when he looked back up, the man was gone. Not walking away, not standing nearby, just gone. The space in front of him was empty. The man frowned and stood up. Maybe the stranger had turned around quickly and walked away. Maybe he had simply missed it. He looked to his left. Nothing. He looked to his right. Still nothing. The area around him was open. There were no walls, no buildings, nowhere someone could disappear that quickly. He walked a few steps forward, scanning the darkness. but the stranger was nowhere to be seen. It was as if he had simply vanished. The man felt confused for a moment, but he quickly dismissed the thought. People move quickly sometimes. Maybe he had just turned away without noticing. He shrugged, put the matches back in his pocket, and sat down again. He finished his cigarette and tried not to think about it, but about 10 minutes later, the quiet night was interrupted by the sound of a small engine approaching. A transport vehicle slowly rolled through the main entrance of the crematorium. Vehicles like that were commonly used to bring bodies to the cremation grounds. The vehicle stopped about 30 feet away. Several workers stepped out and opened the back. They carefully lifted a body wrapped in white cloth. The man barely paid attention at first. He had seen scenes like this many times before, but as the workers carried the body closer and laid it down on one of the platforms, part of the cloth slipped slightly away from the face. For just a moment, the man's face became visible. And the man sitting on the wall immediately felt his entire body freeze, because the face staring upward was the exact same face of the man who had just asked him for a light. Only now, his eyes were closed. His skin looked pale, and his body was completely still. The man slowly stood up, his heart suddenly racing. That couldn't be possible. He stepped closer. Maybe he was mistaken. Maybe it was someone who simply looked very similar. But the closer he got, the clearer the features became. The same face, the same tired expression, the same man. Only now he was lying motionless on a cremation platform. The man felt a wave of nausea rise in his stomach. He turned around and quickly walked toward the exit of the crematorium. Once outside the gates, he leaned forward and vomited. His hands were shaking. His mind struggled to process what he had just seen. For the rest of the night, he tried to convince himself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe he had mistaken one stranger for another. Maybe the dim lighting had distorted the man's features. Maybe his mind had played a trick on him. But even years later, there was one detail he could never explain. When the stranger asked him for a light, he had looked directly into his eyes, and it was the exact same face he saw lying lifeless on that cremation platform minutes later. Stories like that are often dismissed as coincidence. People see a face in poor lighting. They mistake one stranger for another. At least, that's what we tell ourselves, because the alternative is much harder to accept. But the strange thing is that stories like this don't happen just once. Reports of people seeing someone moments after they have died appear again and again across different places and different cultures. Sometimes those encounters happen in locations where life and death exist side by side. Hospitals, places where people arrive every day hoping to get better, but where sometimes not everyone leaves. The next story comes from a man who worked the night shift as a security guard in an aging hospital building in the United States. During the day, the hospital was loud and chaotic. Doctors rushed through hallways, machines beeped constantly. Families filled waiting rooms with quiet conversations and worried faces. But late at night, most of the building fell silent. And during one routine patrol through an empty hallway, the guard saw someone walking toward him. Someone who, according to hospital records, had already died. More than 20 years ago, a man named David worked as a night security guard at a regional hospital in the Midwest. It wasn't the kind of hospital you see in large cities. The building was older. Parts of it had been renovated over the years, but several wings dated back to the late 1960s. The hospital had long, narrow hallways with dull fluorescent lighting and pale green walls that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. During the day, the place was full of movement. Doctors walked quickly from room to room. Nurses pushed carts loaded with medication. Patients were wheeled through the corridors on gurneys. But David never worked during the day. His shift began at 11 p.m. and ended at 7 a.m. By the time he arrived each night, the hospital had already begun to quiet down. Visitors had left. Many patients were asleep. Only a skeleton crew of nurses and doctors remained. David's job was simple. Every hour, he walked a set patrol route through the building. He checked doors, stairwells, and restricted areas. Most nights were uneventful. Occasionally, he would help a nurse locate a patient who had wandered from their room. Sometimes he dealt with someone trying to smoke outside where they weren't supposed to. But most of the time, the hospital was quiet, almost too quiet. One area of the hospital always felt different from the rest. It was the older West Wing. Several floors of that wing had been partially closed due to renovations and declining patient numbers. Only a handful of rooms were still in use. The rest of the hallways sat mostly empty. Lights remained on for safety reasons, but many sections felt abandoned. David had walked those halls hundreds of times, but one night, something happened that he would never forget. It was around 2:15 in the morning. David had just entered the West Wing during his patrol. The hallway stretched nearly 100 feet in front of him. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. Everything looked exactly as it always did. Quiet, still, empty. David began walking down the corridor, the rubber soles of his shoes making soft sounds against the tile floor. Halfway down the hall, he suddenly noticed movement. At the far end of the corridor, someone was standing there. At first, he assumed it was a patient. That wasn't unusual. Some patients wandered out of their rooms during the night, especially those who were elderly or disoriented. The figure was wearing a hospital gown. The man stood near the wall, partially illuminated by the overhead lights. David slowed his pace. "Hey," he called out calmly. "Are you all right?" The man didn't respond. He simply stood there. David continued walking toward him. As he got closer, he could see the patient more clearly. The man appeared to be in his late 50s. His hair was thin and slightly disheveled. His shoulders were hunched forward. He looked weak, almost as if he were struggling to stand. David spoke again. "Sir, you shouldn't be walking around out here alone." Still no response. Then the man slowly turned his head. For a moment, the two of them made eye contact. David would later say there was something deeply unsettling about the man's expression. Not angry, not confused, just empty. The patient then turned his body and began walking down a side corridor. His movements were slow and unsteady. David sighed quietly and followed. He assumed the man had wandered from his room. "Sir, wait a second," David said as he approached the corner. But when David reached the intersection and turned into the side hallway, the corridor was empty, completely empty. David stopped. He looked down the hall. There were only 3 doors in that section. All of them were closed. The hallway ended at a locked stairwell. There was nowhere the man could have gone. David walked to the first door and opened it. A supply room, empty. He opened the second door, an unused patient room, no one inside. The third door led to a small storage closet, also empty. David stood there for several seconds, confused. He was certain he had seen the man turn the corner, but there was no one there. Eventually, he shook his head and continued his patrol. Maybe the patient had moved faster than he expected. Maybe he had stepped into a room just before David turned the corner. Still, the whole situation felt strange. Very strange. The rest of David's shift passed without incident, but the image of the patient in the hallway stayed in his mind. When his shift ended that morning, he mentioned the incident to one of the nurses while they were both in the break room. "I think someone from the West Wing was wandering around last night," David said casually. The nurse looked up from her coffee. "What time?" she asked. "About 2:15. The nurse frowned slightly. What did he look like? David described the man as best as he could. Thin hair, late 50s, hospital gown. The nurse's expression slowly changed. She stood up and walked over to a nearby desk where several patient files were stacked. After flipping through a few pages, she pulled out a chart. She turned it around and showed David the photograph attached to the file. Did he look like this? David felt his stomach tighten. The face in the photograph was unmistakable. It was the same man he had seen in the hallway. "Yes," David said slowly. "That's him." The nurse hesitated before responding. "That's strange," she said quietly. "Why?" She glanced down at the file again. "That patient died last night." David stared at her. "What time?" She checked the chart. 2:05 a.m. David felt a chill run through his body. Because just 10 minutes later, he had watched that same man walk down the hospital hallway. Encounters like these often leave behind more questions than answers. Was it simply a coincidence? A trick of memory? Or is it possible that, in certain places, people sometimes glimpse something that shouldn't be there? Hospitals and crematoriums are places where the line between life and death feels incredibly thin. But sometimes these strange encounters happen far away from places like that. Sometimes they happen on completely ordinary streets, late at night, when the roads are quiet and the world feels almost empty. The final story comes from a taxi driver who worked the late shift in a large American city, a man who had spent years driving strangers through the darkness of the night. He had seen all kinds of passengers, drunk people leaving bars, couples arguing in the back seat, people rushing home after long shifts at work. But one passenger he picked up late one night would leave him with a question he still cannot answer, because halfway through the ride, his passenger disappeared. For nearly 12 years, Marcus worked the night shift as a taxi driver. He actually preferred it. Most drivers hated working overnight. The hours were long, and the streets could sometimes be unpredictable, but Marcus enjoyed the quiet. At night, the city felt different. The noise of daytime traffic faded away. Office buildings went dark. The streets became calm and strangely peaceful. His shift usually started around 9 p.m. and ended close to sunrise. Over the years, Marcus had driven thousands of passengers across the city. He had heard countless stories. Some funny, some sad, some strange, but nothing had ever truly scared him. Until one particular night in late autumn, it was just after midnight. The temperature had dropped, and a thin fog had begun to settle over the streets. Marcus had been driving for about 3 hours when he turned onto a long, quiet road near the edge of the city. Street lights lined the road, but they were spaced far apart. Between them were long stretches of darkness. As Marcus drove slowly down the road, something caught his eye. A woman standing on the sidewalk beneath one of the streetlights. Her arm was raised slightly, the universal signal for a taxi. Marcus slowed down and pulled over. The woman opened the back door and quietly got inside. She didn't say anything at first. Marcus glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She looked pale. Not sickly pale, but unusually pale. Her long dark hair hung loosely around her shoulders. She wore a dark coat that looked slightly too thin for the cold weather. "Where to?" Marcus asked. Her voice was soft when she answered. She gave him an address on the far side of the city. Marcus nodded and started driving. The car moved slowly through the fog-covered streets. For the first few minutes, neither of them spoke. That wasn't unusual. Some passengers preferred silence, but Marcus noticed something strange. The woman never moved, not even slightly. She sat perfectly still in the back seat. Her hands rested in her lap. Her gaze seemed fixed on something outside the window. Marcus tried to make small conversation. "Cold night tonight," he said casually. No response. Maybe she hadn't heard him. He tried again. "Not many people out this late." Still nothing. Marcus glanced in the mirror again. The woman's expression hadn't changed. She was still staring quietly toward the window. Something about her presence made Marcus uneasy. He couldn't explain why. It wasn't anything obvious, just a subtle feeling that something was off. They drove for about 15 minutes. Eventually, they reached the neighborhood she had mentioned. The streets here were older and darker. Tall trees lined the sidewalks, and their branches blocked much of the streetlight. Marcus slowed the car. "Which house number?" he asked. No answer. He frowned slightly and looked back at the mirror. "Mom?" Still nothing. Marcus turned his head slightly to look back into the seat, and instantly felt his stomach drop. The back seat was empty. The woman was gone. Marcus slammed the brakes. The taxi rolled to a stop in the middle of the quiet street. For several seconds, he simply stared at the empty seat. That couldn't be possible. He had just seen her seconds ago. He quickly turned around and opened the back door. Cold night air rushed into the car. Marcus stepped out and looked around. The street was completely empty. No footsteps, no movement. No one walking away, just fog and silence. He walked around the taxi, scanning both sides of the road. Nothing. It was as if the woman had simply vanished from the back seat. Eventually, Marcus got back into the car. His heart was racing. He drove home early that night. The next day, he told the story to another taxi driver he knew. At first, the other driver laughed. Passengers sneaking out without paying wasn't unusual, but when Marcus described exactly where he had picked the woman up, the driver's expression changed. "Wait," the driver said. "Where exactly was she standing?" Marcus described the location. The driver went quiet. Then he said something Marcus would never forget. "You know what's there, right?" "What?" "That spot. That's right next to the old cemetery." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Later that afternoon, he drove back to the location. In daylight, and the other driver had been right. The address the woman had given him didn't belong to a house, it belonged to a cemetery, an old one that had been there for decades. Marcus never saw the woman again, but even years later, whenever he drove that road late at night, he always slowed down slightly as he passed that streetlight, just in case. Someone was standing there, waiting for another ride. Maybe there are logical explanations for every one of these stories. Maybe people sometimes see things in the darkness that their minds later misinterpret. But the strange thing is, stories like these appear all over the world. Different places, different people, yet the same unsettling pattern. Someone meets a stranger, only to discover moments later that the person they just spoke to shouldn't have been there at all. And sometimes, the only question that remains is this: what did they really see?